Welcome to this week's OK at Work with myself, Sarah Sawyer, and my colleague, Russell Berger from the Offit Kurman Labor and Employment Group. And this week, we are talking about hiring practices. A lot of people hiring right now. I know we've talked a lot about that on our episodes about how a lot of people needing to scale up after the pandemic, and then also just the market being what it is for employees and having trouble finding them, and people doing a lot of interviewing, a lot of hiring. So what are some things that people should keep in mind during the hiring process, particularly during interviewing, Russell?
Yeah, so from a legal standpoint, there's a couple of things that you should not do and you should definitely avoid. One is gathering information that about a person's status in a protected class. That if you don't hire the person, could lead to claims that, hey, you asked me these questions, you asked me about my family planning, you asked me about my country of origin, what have you, and then you didn't hire me, so it must be because you're discriminating against me because of the way I answered that question. So you want to avoid questions that get into the various protected classes, and even if you think certain protected classifications are evident, from just sitting down and talking to someone, including pregnancy for that matter, so be it. But it shouldn't be a topic for the interview itself. And I would say that extends to some of the other things like that. In recent years, we've seen salary history bans. There's been more along those lines that you should avoid as well.
Yeah, there are some in line with that. There are also some laws in certain states around having to disclose, salary ranges and things like that when asked by candidates. And so there's lots of things to keep in mind as far as regulations are concerned. Or we've seen, ban the box. So in every state, it's a little bit different. But as
Ban,
far
ban, ban the box being criminal
yeah.
background.
Yep. So criminal background. So if ban the box being if you can't ask about criminal background, in some states it's at all. In a lot of states it's until after the first in-person interview, which is what we have here in Maryland at this point. And there are some exceptions to that depending on the type of job and if there's other reasons. But there's definitely a lot of regulations around hiring that have come up in the last couple of years that people need to be aware of. And then also as far as the protected class, protected classes is around age. So sometimes employers might ask a question hiring that might be, well, how many more years you have left till retirement would not be a question you want to ask as it relates to age as well. So there's a lot of questions that could come to mind to employers that really should not be asked during the hiring process and really could be an issue.
Yeah, we could probably spend this whole episode and for another hour afterwards just coming up with questions that should not be asked. But that's the high level. Conversely, what I think should be asked are experiential questions. So, one thing that happens, and lawyers are as guilty of this as anybody, sometimes for a good reason, is we ask leading questions, and you kind of tell the interviewee, what you want to hear in the way you ask the question. But what's a much better approach in an interview is to get the candidate to tell a story and to say things like, tell me about a time when, and then, when you encountered a difficult client, a difficult boss, you overcame a challenge, whatever, leave it open ended, but let the candidate tell the story and then ask follow-ups on the candidates, what the candidate shares.
And having a good process for that and what questions you want to ask and being thoughtful about it, I think can really make it for an efficient process. As we've discussed a lot on this, on OK at Work, is that there's a lot of hiring needs right now and the market's moving fast. So candidates are interviewing at multiple places and you really want the process to move quickly, especially if you've got a need for an employee. And sometimes people will move through pretty quickly, but you don't want to stumble along the way, end up hiring an employee that isn't qualified just because you really need someone or because there's a lot of competition in the market. So you really want to make sure that you are being thoughtful in your approach, taking your time while also being efficient enough to keep up with the demand and the competition and what your needs are.
Yeah, that's good advice. Sarah, I have a question for you, and I'll model what I said earlier. Tell me about a time when you got a very interesting interview question.
So I think that probably the most interesting question I got was, if I went down to your car right now and we took a ride to lunch, what does your car look like? And so I thought that was a really interesting question around the state of the car. I think that they were getting to organization skills and whether your car would have, 6 bags from McDonald's trash, in the wheel well. But I don't know that I would have admitted that if that was the case. But that was an interesting one. How about you, Russell?
Yeah, no, that reminds me, there's an episode of The Office where Michael Scott has Ryan the temp cleaning out his car and asks him how many filet of fishes he ate because there's littered with those wrappers. Um, yeah, one interesting thing that stood out to me is I was asked to take the Wonderlic test as part of an interview once, which is, like it measures some sort of speed to problem solving. And like they used to do it as part of like the NFL combine process for football players. But they knew it was coming and they could practice the test. And I just showed up to an interview just expecting to talk. And then they had me spend like the first 12 minutes taking this test and then then they grade it, which was a pretty wild experience. But needless to say, I didn't end up working there. So either I didn't do good enough, or just wasn't. We weren't a good match.
Yeah, lots of interesting tools and unconventional questions, I'm sure. So, well, thanks, Russell, and we'll talk. See you next time.
Thanks, Sarah.